It was just another gray morning in the small town of Clearwater, where life moved slowly and faces were familiar. Inside the old diner on Main Street, the smell of fresh coffee and buttered toast filled the air. Rain tapped gently against the windows, and the sound of a sizzling griddle played like background music to the quiet chatter of regulars. Among the usual crowd, a young black waitress named Mia Johnson moved between tables with her practiced smile, balancing trays and refilling cups. Her dark hair was tied neatly back in a bun, her blue uniform slightly faded from countless washes, and her shoes worn thin from long shifts. But her heart was bigger than her paycheck, and that's what made her different. There was a warmth in her eyes that spoke of a woman who understood struggle but refused to let it harden her spirit. Every morning at exactly 8:10, an elderly white man named Mr. Harris would walk through the diner's glass door. He always wore the same gray overcoat and brown hat, his face lined with years of stories no one else seemed to know. He sat by the window in the same booth every day and ordered the same thing: black coffee, 2 slices of toast, and scrambled eggs. But unlike the other customers, he never said much. His hands trembled slightly when he held his cup, and sometimes he stared out at the rain for minutes, lost somewhere far away in his thoughts. There was a hollowness in his eyes that spoke of loneliness deeper than words could capture. Mia had noticed him from her first week at the diner. There was something about him, something that quietly tugged at her heart. The other waitresses just took his order, left the plate, and moved on, but Mia lingered. She asked how his morning was, made sure his toast was warm, and once even slipped him a small piece of pie on the house. It started as kindness, a simple act, but soon it became routine. Every morning she'd greet him with a genuine smile and a fresh cup of coffee before he even asked. She didn't know it yet, but those small moments were planting seeds that would change her life forever. Part 2: Two Souls, One Struggle. Over the weeks, Mia learned bits and pieces about Mr. Harris's life. He used to be a history teacher at Clearwater High School, beloved by students who still remembered him decades later. He'd lost his wife, Alina, 7 years ago to cancer, and lived alone in a small house just outside town. His 2 children had moved away to different states, busy with their own lives, and though he rarely mentioned them, Mia could sense the quiet ache in his silence. Sometimes he brought an old newspaper with him, reading the same articles twice as if trying to make the time pass slower. Other times he just watched people, maybe remembering the life he once had, when his home was filled with laughter and his days had purpose. For Mia, who was struggling to hold herself together, his quiet company became oddly comforting. Because Mia's life wasn't easy either. Her mother, Patricia, was battling diabetes and heart problems, and the medical bills were piling up faster than she could pay them. The insurance barely covered anything, and the copays alone were drowning her. She worked double shifts at the diner, took night classes at the community college hopping for a better future, and often skipped her own meals just to make sure her mother had her medications and enough to eat. There were nights she cried alone in her small apartment, wondering how much longer she could hold everything together. The weight of it all pressed down on her shoulders like stones in a bag she couldn't put down. But every morning, no matter how tired she was, no matter how heavy her heart felt, she greeted Mr. Harris with warmth. Helping him, even in small ways, reminded her that kindness still mattered, that maybe life wasn't all struggle. In caring for this lonely old man, she found a sliver of light in her own darkness. She'd refill his coffee without him asking, remember how he liked his eggs, and sometimes sit with him for just a moment when the diner was quiet, asking about his teaching days or what book he was reading. Those moments meant more to both of them than either could say. Part 3: When the Routine Breaks. One cold winter morning, when the snow had begun to fall in thick, silent sheets, Mr. Harris didn't show up. Mia noticed right away. The booth by the window stayed empty, and something inside her tightened with worry. She kept glancing at the door, waiting for the familiar sight of his gray coat and brown hat, but it never came. The next day came, and still no sign of him. By the third morning, genuine fear had settled in her chest. She even asked a few regulars if they'd seen him, but no one knew anything. Mr. Harris had always been a solitary figure in town, someone people recognized but didn't really know. During her short break, Mia called the small local hospital, her hands trembling as she held the phone. Her heart sank when the nurse confirmed he had been admitted 3 days ago after a fall at home. He'd been lying on his kitchen floor for hours before a neighbor heard him calling for help. Without thinking twice, Mia grabbed her coat and drove to the hospital. When she walked into his room, Mr. Harris looked frail, his skin pale against the white hospital sheets, but his eyes showed surprise and something that looked like gratitude. No one else had come to visit him. She stayed by his side, brought him a small muffin from the diner wrapped in a napkin, and promised she'd check on him until he got better. His voice was weak when he thanked her, and she saw tears forming in the corners of his eyes. For the next week, between shifts and classes, Mia visited him every single day. She brought him coffee in a thermos, a flower from the grocery store, and sometimes just her presence and a smile. The nurses began to notice her dedication, whispering among themselves that the young waitress from the diner had a heart of gold. One nurse, an older black woman named Mrs. Thompson, pulled Mia aside one evening. "Baby, that man in there has been here a whole week, and you're the only person who's walked through that door for him. You're an angel." Mia just shook her head softly. "He's been alone too long. Nobody should be alone like that." Part 4. The Return and the Quiet Words. A week and a half later, Mr. Harris returned to the diner. His walk was slower, more careful, and his hands seemed weaker as he gripped his cane, but his eyes were different now. They were softer, brighter even, as if something inside him had awakened. When Mia saw him push through the glass door, her face lit up like sunrise. She rushed over, helped him to his booth, made sure his coat was hung properly on the hook, and brought him his breakfast with extra care. She even added an extra piece of bacon, something she paid for out of her own tips. He didn't say much that day, but before he left, he looked at her for a long, searching moment. His voice was quiet but clear when he finally spoke. "You remind me of my daughter, the person I always hoped she'd be." Mia smiled, touched but not understanding the full weight of those words. "That's real sweet of you, Mr. Harris. I'm just glad you're feeling better." He nodded slowly, his eyes holding hers. "You have no idea what you've done for me, young lady. No idea at all." Days turned into weeks and things returned to their gentle routine. Mr. Harris came every morning and Mia greeted him with the same warmth. But there was something different now, something deeper in their brief exchanges. He seemed more present, more intentional, as if he was storing up these moments like treasure. Sometimes he'd ask about her mother, and Mia would share honestly the struggles and the fears. He'd listen with the quiet attention of someone who truly cared, and occasionally offered gentle words of encouragement that carried the wisdom of his years. Other customers noticed the bond between them. Some smiled at it, touched by the tenderness. Others didn't pay it much mind. But in that small booth by the window, something beautiful and rare was unfolding, a friendship built on nothing more than human kindness and mutual recognition of each other's worth. Neither of them knew how little time they had left. Part 5. The Day Everything Changed. It was a Tuesday morning a few months after Mr. Harris had returned from the hospital. The diner was in its usual rhythm, coffee brewing, bacon sizzling, regulars chatting about the weather and last night's game. Mia was refilling sugar containers near the counter, humming softly to herself, when the door opened. But it wasn't Mr. Harris. Instead, 4 men in expensive black suits walked in, their presence so sharp and commanding it cut through the room's comfortable calm like a knife. Behind them came 2 lawyers carrying leather briefcases, their expressions serious and professional. The entire diner fell silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even the cook looked up from the griddle. Mia froze when they stopped directly in front of her counter. Her heart began to race, a terrible feeling spreading through her chest. Had something happened to her mother? Was she in some kind of trouble? "Are you Mia Johnson?" one of the lawyers asked, his voice formal but not unkind. Her throat felt tight. "Yes, sir. Is something wrong?" The lawyer exchanged a glance with his colleague before speaking. "We represent the estate of Mr. Thomas Harris." The world seemed to tilt. Mia gripped the counter to steady herself. "Represent? What do you mean?" "Mr. Harris passed away last week," the lawyer said gently. "He spoke very highly of you in his final arrangements. He wanted us to deliver this to you personally." Mia's breath caught in her chest. The sound of dishes clattering, the hum of conversation, everything around her faded into a distant blur. She could barely hear herself whisper, "He's gone." The second lawyer stepped forward, his tone softer now. "He passed peacefully in his sleep, and he left something for you." One of the men in suits handed her a sealed manila envelope. Her hands trembled so badly she almost dropped it. The regulars who knew her, who'd watched her care for Mr. Harris all these months, sat in stunned silence. Some had tears in their eyes. Mia's manager, a middle-aged man named Frank, came out from the kitchen and gently guided her to a booth, sensing she needed to sit down. The lawyers followed, sitting across from her with quiet patience. With shaking hands, Mia opened the envelope. Part 6, the letter that changed everything. Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter on cream-colored stationery, the kind people don't use much anymore. Mr. Harris's handwriting was careful and slightly shaky, but every word was clear. Mia's vision blurred with tears as she began to read. "Dear Mia, if you're reading this, then I've gone on to be with my Alina. Don't be sad for me, I'm at peace now. I'm writing this because I need you to understand something important. In the last years of my life, I felt invisible. My children stopped calling. My friends had all passed or moved away. I went to that diner every morning not because I was hungry, but because I didn't want to be alone with my thoughts in that empty house. I was just waiting to die, if I'm honest. And then you showed up. You with your kind smile and your warm heart. You treated me like I mattered. You remembered how I liked my coffee. You asked about my day like you actually cared about the answer. When I fell and ended up in that hospital, you were the only person who came. Not my own children, you. A young woman who barely knew me but cared enough to show up. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever, dignity. You reminded me that my life still had value, that I was still a human being worth noticing. In those final months, you were more family to me than my own blood." Mia had to stop reading. Tears were streaming down her face, and her shoulders shook with quiet sobs. The lawyer sitting across from her waited patiently, his own eyes slightly moist. After a moment, she continued reading. "I'm not a wealthy man, Mia, but I have something I want you to have. My house and everything in it now belongs to you. I've also set aside what money I had left. It should be enough to help with your mother's medical bills and give you a chance to breathe. You've been carrying so much weight on those young shoulders. Let me help lighten the load just as you lightened mine. Keep being exactly who you are. This world needs more people like you. With all my gratitude and affection, Thomas Harris." The lawyer cleared his throat gently and slid a folder across the table. "Everything is legally binding and notarized. Mr. Harris updated his will 4 months ago. The house is yours, free and clear. The financial transfer should process within a week." Part 7, the weight of a gift. Mia sat in that booth for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, clutching the letter to her chest. Around her, the diner had come back to life in whispers. Customers she'd served for years watched with tears in their own eyes, moved by the scene they'd just witnessed. Frank, her manager, put a hand on her shoulder. "Take the rest of the day, Mia. Take the week if you need it." She nodded numbly, unable to form words. The lawyers explained the practical details, keys, documents, accounts, but Mia barely heard them. Her mind was spinning. Just yesterday morning, she'd been wondering how she'd make next month's rent. She'd been eating ramen noodles for dinner 5 nights a week to save money. She'd been praying for a miracle while her mother's condition slowly worsened because they couldn't afford the better treatments. And now this. That evening, after the lawyers left and she'd somehow made it through the rest of her shift in a daze, Mia drove to Mr. Harris's house. She'd never been inside before. It sat on a quiet street lined with old oak trees, a modest craftsman-style home with a front porch and flower boxes in the windows. She used the key the lawyers had given her and stepped inside. The house was small but warm, filled with books lining every wall, photographs in simple frames, and furniture that had been cared for over decades. Everything was neat and orderly, the home of a man who'd lived alone but with dignity. On his desk in the study, she found something that made her knees weak. It was a framed photograph, one she hadn't known existed. It showed her and Mr. Harris at the diner, both of them laughing. She remembered that morning. She'd accidentally spilled coffee on the counter and it had dripped onto his newspaper. Instead of being angry, he'd laughed, really laughed, for the first time she could remember. Another customer must have captured the moment. He had framed it. He had kept it on his desk where he could see it every day. Mia sank into his reading chair, the photograph clutched in her hands, and finally let herself break down completely. Part 8. The Legacy of Kindness. 3 weeks later, Mia stood in that same house, her house now, with her mother, Patricia, who was crying tears of joy and disbelief. They'd paid off every medical bill. Patricia could finally get the treatments her doctors had been recommending. They had a real home now, with a yard and neighbors and safety. Mia had framed Mr. Harris's letter and hung it in the living room, right next to that photograph of them laughing together. She'd also found a beautiful picture of him and Alina on their wedding day, young and radiant, and given it a place of honor on the mantel. She continued working at the diner. She didn't need to anymore, not really, but it mattered to her. Those people were her community. That place was where she'd learned the power of simply showing up for someone. Word had spread through Clearwater about what happened. At first, Mia was embarrassed by the attention, but Frank told her something that stuck. Let people see this, Mia. Let them know that goodness still exists. That kindness comes back around. Lord knows we need to believe that right now. So she did, and something beautiful started happening. Other people in town began reaching out to their lonely neighbors. The diner started a program where regulars could buy a meal for someone who couldn't afford one. Small acts of kindness rippled outward like stones thrown in still water. One morning, about 2 months after Mr. Harris passed, an elderly black woman came into the diner and sat in his old booth by the window. She looked lost and lonely, her hands trembling slightly as she studied the menu. Mia walked over with a warm smile and a fresh cup of coffee. "Good morning, ma'am. Welcome. Can I start you off with some coffee?" The woman looked up, surprised by the genuine warmth in Mia's voice, and smiled back. "That would be lovely, dear. Thank you." As Mia poured the coffee and made sure the woman felt welcomed and seen, she felt Mr. Harris's presence like a gentle hand on her shoulder. She understood now what he'd given her, not just a house or money, but a mission. A reminder that the smallest acts of human kindness can echo through lifetimes. She thought of his words, "Keep being exactly who you are." And she would. For him, for her mother, for herself, and for every lonely soul who walked through that diner door looking for nothing more than to be noticed, to be valued, to be reminded that they still mattered. Because in the end, love in its simplest form, a smile, a warm cup of coffee, a moment of genuine attention, is the most powerful legacy any of us can leave behind. And Mia Johnson, a humble waitress from Clearwater, would spend the rest of her life making sure that legacy lived on.